The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty road leading to Henderson's farm equipment, the only substantial agricultural supply store in the small town of Cedar Creek, Texas. The place was barely a dot on the map, but for the locals, it represented their livelihood, their dreams, and sometimes their heartbreaks. It was in this unassuming setting that Carlos Mendez drove his worn-out pickup truck, the engine sputtering slightly before he turned it off with a practiced twist of his wrist. Carlos sat for a moment, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the store entrance. Today was the culmination of 7 years of saving every penny, working double shifts as a capataz at the Johnson farm, and countless sacrifices that only he knew the full extent of. Beside him, his 17-year-old son Miguel fidgeted nervously. "You think they'll have the model we saw in the catalog, Papa?" Miguel asked, his voice betraying his excitement despite trying to sound casual. Carlos smiled, the lines around, his eyes deepening. "I hope so, mijo. That John Deere 5045E would change everything for us." He didn't need to explain further. Miguel knew what everything meant. It meant expanding their modest 10-acre plot into a productive farm. It meant growing enough to sell at the local market rather than just feeding themselves. It meant Miguel could go to college next year to study agricultural engineering, something Carlos had promised his wife Maria before she passed away from cancer 5 years ago. What Miguel didn't fully grasp was how Carlos had managed to save $22,000 while paying medical bills, keeping food on the table, and maintaining their small home. He didn't know about the nights his father took on extra work, mending fences, or the lunches Carlos skipped to save a few dollars more each week. "Ready?" Carlos asked, reaching for the door handle. Miguel nodded, hopping out of the truck with the energy of youth, while Carlos moved more deliberately, his left leg stiff from an accident 2 years prior when a spooked horse had kicked him, crushing several bones below his knee. The doctors had done what they could, but Carlos would never walk the same again. Are you watching one of our videos for the first time? Welcome to our channel. We love sharing these incredible true stories with all of you wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with our audience from all around the country. As the bell above the door jingled announcing their entrance, Carlos straightened his posture and adjusted his worn but clean plaid shirt. Dignity was something no accident or hardship could take from him, and he wanted to look his best for this momentous purchase. Henderson's was buzzing with activity. That Saturday morning, farmers from across the county came to purchase supplies, discuss the weather forecast, or simply enjoy the free coffee that had been a store tradition for 3 decades. Carlos scanned the room, recognizing a few faces who nodded in greeting, but his eyes were searching for the used equipment section where he knew the tractor would be. "Can I help you find something?" a young woman asked, her name tag reading Sarah. "Yes, we're looking for the used tractors," Carlos replied with a slight accent that had softened over his 20 years in Texas, but never completely disappeared. "Particularly the John Deere 5045E that was advertised in last week's circular." Sarah smiled. "That would be in our pre-owned equipment section in the back. Blake Thompson handles all those sales. I'll let him know you're interested." As she walked away, Miguel whispered, "That's it, Papa. I can see it from here." Indeed, in the corner of the large showroom floor sat the green and yellow tractor that had occupied Carlos's dreams for months. It wasn't brand new, showing signs of previous use, but it was well maintained and, most importantly, within his budget. Carlos felt his heart race with anticipation as he limped toward it, Miguel practically bouncing alongside him. What neither of them noticed was the man in the worn jeans, faded blue plaid shirt, and a Texas Rangers baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, who was examining a larger tractor nearby. The man looked ordinary enough that no one would give him a second glance, which was precisely what George Strait wanted when he ventured out without his entourage. George had been browsing for nearly 30 minutes, enjoying the anonymity that simple clothes and a well-worn cap provided. At 63 years old, with a career spanning over 3 decades, 30 platinum albums, and more #1 hits than any artist in any genre, George Strait valued these rare moments of normalcy. He was looking for a new compact tractor for his grandson to learn on, something safe but authentic for the boy who already showed signs of loving ranch life as much as his famous grandfather did. Meanwhile, Blake Thompson emerged from the back office, alerted by Sarah that there were customers interested in used equipment. Blake had been the lead salesman at Henderson's for nearly 8 years, and his reputation around town was decidedly mixed. To the wealthy ranchers and established farmers, he was attentive and courteous. To the smaller operators, especially those like Carlos, who came from different backgrounds, his demeanor often shifted dramatically. "You're looking at the 5045E?" Blake asked, his voice already carrying a note of skepticism as he approached Carlos and Miguel. Carlos nodded, extending his hand. "Carlos Mendez, this is my son, Miguel. We spoke on the phone last week about this model." Blake barely touched Carlos's hand before withdrawing his own and wiping it subtly against his pants. "Right. You mentioned wanting to see it. Didn't think you were serious about purchasing." Miguel frowned at the disrespectful gesture, but stayed quiet when Carlos shot him a warning glance. "I am very serious," Carlos said firmly. "I've been saving for this specific model. 45 horsepower is perfect for our needs, and the price point fits my budget." Blake walked around the tractor, his body language suggesting he was merely humoring Carlos. "This is actually a sophisticated piece of machinery, Mr. Mendez. Maintenance alone costs quite a bit. I'm not sure it's appropriate for someone in your position." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Miguel's face flushed with anger, but Carlos maintained his composure. "I've been working with farm equipment for 25 years, Mr. Thompson," Carlos replied evenly. "I was the head capataz at the Johnson Ranch for 15 of those years. I understand machinery maintenance very well." Blake raised an eyebrow. "Capataz? Oh, you mean foreman. Well, understanding machinery and being able to afford it are 2 different things. This tractor may be used, but it's still $22,000. Carlos reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I am aware of the price. I have the full amount here in cash, as we discussed on the phone." Across the showroom, George Strait had begun paying more attention to the conversation than to the tractor he was supposedly examining. Something in the salesman's tone had caught his ear, and now he watched the interaction unfold while pretending to read the specification sheet for a fertilizer spreader. Blake looked genuinely surprised when Carlos produced the envelope, but his expression quickly changed to one of suspicion. "You have 22,000 in cash. I'm not sure we can accept that much currency without additional verification." "Where did you get that kind of money?" Miguel stepped forward. "My father saved for 7 years. He worked extra jobs and—" "I wasn't asking you, kid," Blake interrupted. "Look, Mr. Mendez, this isn't some roadside stand. We sell professional equipment to professional farmers. This tractor requires proper maintenance schedules, specific technical knowledge." "Which I have," Carlos interjected, his patience beginning to wear thin. "I've operated every make and model on the Johnson Ranch. I can strip down and rebuild a transmission if necessary." Blake's face hardened. "This isn't a tractor for amateurs or people who can't pay for proper maintenance," he said loudly enough for others nearby to hear. "You really think someone like you can afford a machine like this? Come back when you have real money, or send your boss here." Carlos stood perfectly still, his dignity intact despite the public humiliation. "I am not an amateur, and this is real money that I earned through honest work. I don't have a boss anymore. I work my own land now." 10 acres isn't a farm," Blake scoffed, having clearly looked up Carlos's information after their phone call. "It's a garden." Miguel couldn't contain himself any longer. "My father worked harder than anyone to save for this. He deserves your respect." Blake turned to Miguel with a cold smile. "Your father deserves what he can afford, and this isn't it. These machines are for real farmers, not for, well, you understand." Carlos placed a steadying hand on Miguel's shoulder, feeling his son trembling with rage. The showroom had grown quieter as other customers began noticing the confrontation. Carlos saw pity in some faces, discomfort in others, but no one stepped forward. "Perhaps we should speak to another salesperson," Carlos suggested quietly. "I handle all used equipment sales," Blake replied smugly, "and I'm telling you this tractor isn't for you. But hey, we have some older models out back that might be more appropriate." The implication was clear. Those models would be inferior, but more suited to someone of Carlos's standing. Carlos felt his chest tighten with a mix of anger and disappointment. 7 years of sacrifice, and now this man was standing between him and his dream based on nothing but prejudice. It was at this moment that Blake noticed the man in the baseball cap examining the high-end tractors. Immediately recognizing a potentially lucrative sale, Blake's demeanor transformed. "Excuse me," he said abruptly to Carlos and Miguel. "I need to assist another customer. Feel free to look around at the other options." Blake approached George with an obsequious smile. "Can I help you with something, sir? That's our premium model, perfect for large properties." George looked up from the brochure he'd been pretending to read. "Just browsing," he said simply, but his eyes kept drifting to Carlos and Miguel, who now stood by the tractor looking defeated. "This is our top-of-the-line model," Blake continued eagerly. 55 horsepower, hydraulic loader, the works. For someone who clearly knows quality, this would be perfect. George nodded thoughtfully, then gestured toward Carlos and Miguel. "What about those folks over there? Seemed like they were interested in something." Blake waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't worry about them. They're not serious buyers. Now about this model's specifications." George interrupted him. "Actually, I'm curious. What model were they looking at?" Blake's smile faltered slightly at George's continued interest in the other customers. "Just a basic used model, nothing someone like yourself would be interested in." "Mind if I take a look at it anyway?" George asked, already walking toward Carlos and Miguel. Blake hurried after him. "Sir, I can assure you that's not worth your time. I have several premium options that would be much more suited to your needs." George ignored him, stopping in front of Carlos and Miguel with a friendly nod. "This the one you're looking at?" he asked, gesturing to the John Deere 5045E. Carlos, surprised by the stranger's interest, nodded. "Yes, sir. It would be perfect for our small farm." "How many acres you working?" George asked conversationally. 10 now," Carlos answered. "But with this tractor, we could lease another 15 from our neighbor who's retiring." Miguel added proudly, "My father saved for 7 years to buy it." George nodded appreciatively. "That's determination. What are you planning to grow?" As Carlos began explaining his plans for expanding from subsistence farming to growing organic vegetables for local markets, Blake grew increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Sir," Blake interrupted, addressing George, "I have several other models I'd like to show you that would be more appropriate for someone of your standing." George turned to Blake with a raised eyebrow. "My standing?" "Well, yes," Blake stammered. "I mean, you clearly need something more substantial than this basic model." "How would you know what I need?" George asked mildly. "We haven't even introduced ourselves yet." Blake faltered, suddenly uncertain. George reached up and removed his cap, revealing his face completely. There was an instant of silence. Then a wave of recognition swept through the store. Employees and customers alike froze in place as they realized who had been shopping among them unnoticed. "I'm George Strait," he said simply, extending his hand to Carlos. "And you are?" Carlos blinked in surprise, but accepted the handshake. "Carlos Mendez, sir. This is my son, Miguel. It's an honor to meet you." Blake Thompson's face had drained of all color. "Mr. Strait," he managed to stammer, "I had no idea. We're honored to have you in our store today. If you'd known it was me," George interrupted, his voice still mild, but now carrying an undercurrent of steel, "would you have treated me differently than you treated this man?" The silence that descended upon Henderson's farm equipment store was absolute. Customers and employees alike stood frozen, many with their mouths slightly agape. George Strait, the king of country, was standing in their midst, and he was clearly unhappy with what he had just witnessed. Blake Thompson's face had gone from pale to ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as he struggled to find words. "Mr. Strait, there's been a misunderstanding," Blake finally managed to stutter. George's expression remained calm, but his eyes had hardened. In his decades-long career, he had witnessed plenty of discrimination and prejudice. Coming from humble beginnings himself, he had never forgotten the value of treating everyone with dignity. "Actually," George said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent store, "I think I understand the situation perfectly. This gentleman was here first, trying to purchase this tractor with money he saved for 7 years, and you were treating him like he didn't belong here." Blake swallowed hard. "Sir, I was merely trying to direct him toward equipment that might be more suitable for his needs." "More suitable?" George raised an eyebrow. "You mean less expensive, less dignified? I heard exactly what you said to him and his son." Carlos placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder, unsure how to react to this unexpected turn of events. His son was staring at George Strait with a mixture of awe and gratitude, while Carlos himself felt a complex wave of emotions. Appreciation for the intervention, but also the lingering sting of humiliation. "Mr. Strait," Blake attempted again, "as the store's lead salesman, it's my job to match customers with the right equipment. And I felt that perhaps Mr. Mendez here wasn't fully aware of the maintenance requirements and—" "Stop," George said, quietly, but with enough authority that Blake instantly fell silent. "I grew up on a farm in Pearsall, Texas, spent years working the land before I ever picked up a guitar professionally. I know exactly what kind of knowledge it takes to maintain farm equipment, and I also know when someone's making assumptions about another person based on how they look or sound." He turned to Carlos. "Mr. Mendez, you mentioned you were the capataz at Johnson Ranch." Carlos nodded. "Yes, sir. 15 years. George smiled knowingly. "Old Bill Johnson doesn't trust his equipment with just anybody. He's about the pickiest rancher in 3 counties when it comes to his machinery." Carlos couldn't help but smile back. "That's true. He made me rebuild an entire transmission just to prove I could before he promoted me to capataz." By now, a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, store employees and customers alike watching the unfolding scene with rapt attention. Among them was an older man in a worn denim jacket who had emerged from a back office. His name tag identified him as Frank Henderson, owner. "What's going on out here?" Frank asked, his eyes widening when he recognized George Strait standing in his store. George turned to the owner. "Mr. Henderson, I was just getting to know Mr. Mendez here, who's been trying to purchase this tractor." He gestured toward the John Deere. "Unfortunately, your salesman seems to have some issues with serving certain customers." Frank's face reddened as he looked from George to Blake to Carlos, quickly piecing together what had happened. "Mr. Strait, it's an honor to have you in our store. Mr. Mendez, I apologize if there's been any misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," George said firmly. Your salesman told this man that the tractor wasn't for people like him and suggested he send his boss in to make the purchase, despite Mr. Mendez explaining that he has the full amount in cash and years of experience maintaining farm equipment. Frank's expression darkened as he turned to Blake. Is this true? Blake's arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by naked fear for his job. I was just trying to make sure he understood the commitment. These machines aren't toys. And the financing can be— He has cash, George interrupted. $22,000 that he saved for 7 years. No financing needed. Miguel, who had been watching the exchange with growing confidence, stepped forward. My father worked double shifts and weekends for years to save for this. He knows more about tractors than anyone I know. Frank Henderson rubbed his face, the weariness in his expression suggesting this might not be the first complaint about Blake's behavior. Mr. Mendez, I want to personally apologize. This is not how we do business at Henderson's. It has been in my family for 3 generations, and we've always prided ourselves on treating everyone fairly. Carlos nodded slowly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he had endured. I appreciate that, Mr. Henderson. I just want to purchase the tractor I called about last week. My son and I have plans for expanding our farm operation, and planting season won't wait. Frank turned to Blake. Go to my office and wait for me there. Blake opened his mouth as if to protest, but one look at his boss's face told him it would be unwise. With a last desperate glance at George Strait, he slunk toward the back office. Sarah, Frank called to the young woman who had first greeted Carlos and Miguel, would you please help Mr. Mendez complete his purchase? Give him our maintenance package at no additional cost. Sarah nodded eagerly. Of course, Mr. Henderson. As Sarah led Carlos toward the sales counter, Miguel lingered behind for a moment, looking up at George Strait with undisguised admiration. Thank you, sir, he said simply. George smiled warmly at the teenager. No need for thanks, son. Your father earned that tractor, and nobody has the right to treat him with anything less than respect. Miguel nodded solemnly. He's worked so hard. After my mom died, and then his accident, he never stopped. This tractor means everything to us. Something in the boy's earnest explanation touched George deeply. Tell me more about your plans, he said, walking alongside Miguel toward the counter where Carlos was completing the paperwork. Miguel's face lit up. We have these 10 acres that used to be part of my grandfather's land. It's good soil, but we've only been able to work part of it without the right equipment. There's a neighbor, Mr. Daniels, who's retiring and willing to lease us another 15 acres. With this tractor, we can cultivate everything and start growing organic vegetables to sell at the farmers' markets in Austin and San Antonio. George nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like a solid plan. You interested in farming yourself? I want to study agricultural engineering, Miguel replied. Learn how to make our operation more efficient, maybe develop irrigation systems that use less water. That's why— He hesitated, then continued more quietly. That's why this tractor is so important. If we can expand production, we can afford college tuition. By this time, they had reached Carlos, who was signing the final paperwork for his purchase. Frank Henderson stood nearby, still looking uncomfortable about the earlier incident. Mr. Mendez, George said, your son was just telling me about your expansion plans. Sounds promising. Carlos looked up with a smile that transformed his weathered face. It's been our dream for a long time. With this tractor and the additional land we can lease, we'll finally have a chance to make it real. George leaned against the counter casually, but his mind was working quickly. He had always believed in helping others, particularly those who demonstrated the kind of work ethic and determination that Carlos clearly possessed. I have a proposition for you, George said after a moment. I'm looking to source some organic produce for my restaurant ventures. Been wanting to work directly with local farmers rather than going through distributors. Would you be interested in discussing a potential supply arrangement once you get your operation expanded? Carlos stared at George in disbelief. Your restaurants would buy from our farm? George nodded. If the quality's good, absolutely. Farm to table isn't just a trendy phrase for me. It's how I was raised. Nothing tastes better than vegetables harvested that morning. Frank Henderson, who had been listening to the exchange, added, The Mendes family has always grown exceptional produce, Mr. Strait. Even on their small plot, Carlos has managed to develop some of the best tomatoes and peppers in the county. Carlos looked between the two men, momentarily speechless at this unexpected turn of events. We would be honored to supply your restaurants, Mr. Strait. George pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card, handing it to Carlos. This has my manager's contact information. Give him a call in about 3 months, once you've had time to get that tractor working and expand your planting. Tell him I sent you, and he'll arrange a meeting to discuss specifics. Miguel, who had been following the conversation with widening eyes, could barely contain his excitement. We won't let you down, sir. Our vegetables are going to be the best you've ever tasted. Carlos carefully tucked the business card into his wallet, his hands slightly trembling. What had begun as a day of humiliation was transforming into something entirely different, a day of new possibilities. There's one more thing, George said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. I'm working on a program to support young people interested in agricultural education. He turned to Miguel. Your father mentioned you want to study agricultural engineering? Miguel nodded eagerly. Yes, sir, at Texas A&M, if I can get in and we can afford it. George smiled. I happen to know a few people there. What would you say to me making a phone call on your behalf? No guarantees, of course, but I'd be happy to put in a good word. Miguel looked as if he might faint. That would be... I don't know what to say. Say yes, George replied with a chuckle. Yes, definitely yes, Miguel exclaimed. Carlos placed a hand on his son's shoulder, visibly moved. Mr. Strait, your kindness is overwhelming. We came here today just hoping to purchase a tractor and... Now... George waved away his thanks. Call me George, please, and it's not kindness. It's recognition of hard work and determination. Those are values worth supporting. Frank Henderson, who had been watching the exchange with increasing amazement, cleared his throat. Mr. Mendes, the paperwork is all complete. The tractor is yours. We can deliver it to your property this afternoon if that works for you. Carlos nodded gratefully. That would be perfect. As they finalized the delivery arrangements, more customers had filtered into the store, word having spread through town that George Strait was at Henderson's farm equipment. George noticed the growing crowd and the smartphones discreetly, and some not so discreetly, pointed in his direction. Looks like my cover's blown, he said to Carlos with a good-natured smile. Was hoping to do my shopping incognito today. Carlos looked apologetic. I'm sorry if our situation caused you problems. George shook his head firmly. Not at all. I'm glad I was here. He glanced toward the back office where Blake Thompson had disappeared. Some lessons need to be learned, and maybe today's events will encourage some reflection. Just then, the door to Frank Henderson's office opened, and Blake emerged, his expression a mixture of defiance and fear. Frank motioned him over, and Blake approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Mr. Strait, Mr. Mendes, Frank said formally, Blake has something he would like to say. Blake looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment as he became aware of how many people were watching. Mr. Mendes, I apologize for my behavior earlier. It was unprofessional and... He swallowed hard. And prejudiced. You deserved better treatment as our customer. Carlos regarded the salesman thoughtfully. After a moment, he extended his hand. Apology accepted, Mr. Thompson. Perhaps next time. You'll remember that a man's character isn't determined by his accent or his appearance. Blake shook Carlos's hand briefly, then turned to George. "Mr. Strait, I apologize to you as well. It's been an honor to have you in our store, and I'm sorry that your visit was marred by my behavior." George studied Blake's face, trying to determine if the apology was sincere or merely delivered under duress. "Mistakes happen," he said finally. "What matters is learning from them." Frank cleared his throat again. "Blake will be taking some time off to reconsider his approach to customer service. When he returns, it will be in a different role where he can learn more about our diverse customer base and their needs." Blake's face fell at this public announcement of what was clearly a demotion, but he nodded stiffly. With the formalities concluded, Carlos and Miguel prepared to leave, needing to return home to prepare for the tractor delivery. As they headed toward the door, George fell into step beside them. "If you don't mind," he said, "I'd like to stop by your place sometime in the next few weeks to see that tractor in action, maybe get some fresh vegetables while I'm at it." Carlos looked at him in surprise. "You would visit our farm?" George smiled. "I'm always interested in seeing hard-working folks making their dreams happen. Besides, I meant what I said about sourcing produce. Need to see the operation firsthand." Miguel could barely contain his excitement. "We'd be honored, sir. I can show you the irrigation system I designed. It's not fancy, but it works really well for our tomatoes." The three men reached the door, and George noticed several people with phones ready, waiting to capture his exit. He turned to Carlos one last time. "Would you mind if we took a photo together? Might help spread the word about your farm once you're ready to start selling." Carlos straightened with pride. "Of course." As they posed for a photo, George in the middle with his arms around Carlos and Miguel's shoulders, the onlookers captured not just an image of a country music legend with fans, but the beginning of a relationship that would soon transform more lives than just the Mendes families. 3 weeks later, the Mendes farm was almost unrecognizable. What had once been a modest 10-acre plot with only half the land under cultivation was now a hive of activity. The John Deere tractor had transformed Carlos's operation, allowing him to prepare all his existing land, plus the additional 15 acres he'd leased from old Mr. Daniels next door. Carlos worked from dawn till dusk, his spirit rejuvenated despite the physical limitations of his injured leg. Miguel had proven himself an invaluable partner, rushing home from school each day to help his father, implementing the irrigation designs he'd been sketching for years, but never had the resources to build. The father-son team moved with a new sense of purpose, their conversations filled with plans and possibilities that had seemed like distant dreams just weeks before. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when a black pickup truck with tinted windows turned onto the dirt road leading to the Mendes property. Miguel, who was adjusting a sprinkler valve at the edge of the field, spotted it first. "Papa!" he called out, waving toward Carlos, who was marking rows for planting. "Someone's coming!" Carlos straightened, shielding his eyes against the sun as he watched the unfamiliar vehicle approach. They weren't expecting visitors, and unannounced guests were rare this far out of town. As the truck drew closer, Miguel jogged over to stand beside his father, both of them curious and slightly apprehensive. The truck stopped in a small cloud of dust, and the driver's door opened to reveal George Strait, dressed casually in jeans, boots, and a button-down shirt, with his signature cowboy hat shading his eyes. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important," George called out as he approached them. Carlos's face broke into a wide smile. "Mr. Strait, what a surprise!" "I told you I'd come by to see that tractor in action," George replied, extending his hand to Carlos, then to Miguel. "And please, it's George." Miguel was practically vibrating with excitement. "We didn't think you'd really come. I mean, you must be so busy with concerts and everything." George chuckled. "I keep my promises, son. Besides, I've been curious. to see what you've accomplished here." He looked around, taking in the freshly tilled fields and the new irrigation pipes snaking across the property. "Looks like you've been busy." Carlos nodded proudly. "The tractor has changed everything. We've prepared all 25 acres for planting. Miguel designed an irrigation system that uses 30% less water than conventional methods." "Impressive," George said, genuinely interested. "Mind showing me around?" For the next hour, Carlos and Miguel led George across their property, showing him the improvements they'd made and explaining their plans for different crops. George listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own deep knowledge of farming practices. Miguel was particularly excited to show off his irrigation system, explaining the mathematics behind the water pressure calculations with such enthusiasm that George couldn't help but smile. "You've got a real talent, son," George commented, as Miguel demonstrated how he'd rigged a solar-powered pump to recirculate water. "Texas A&M would be lucky to have you." Miguel's expression clouded slightly. "If we can afford it, even with the expanded farm, tuition is still going to be tight." George nodded thoughtfully but said nothing, making a mental note. As they approached the farmhouse, a modest single-story structure with a small porch, Carlos gestured toward it apologetically. "It's not much, but would you like to come in for some iced tea? Miguel makes it fresh with mint from our garden." "I'd like that very much," George replied. The interior of the Mendez home was simple but immaculately clean. Photographs lined the walls, many featuring a beautiful woman with Miguel's eyes, whom George assumed was Carlos's late wife. There was a certain warmth to the place that expensive homes often lacked. Miguel hurried to the kitchen to prepare the tea, while Carlos showed George to the small living room. On the coffee table lay several agricultural magazines, well thumbed and dog-eared, alongside textbooks on irrigation engineering that looked far too advanced for high school studies. "Your son is quite dedicated to his education," George observed, gesturing toward the books. Carlos nodded proudly. "He's always been that way. After Maria passed, he became even more determined. He wants to create systems that will help small farmers compete with the big operations. It's not just about our farm for him. He wants to make a difference for others like us." "That's a worthy ambition," George said. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I made that call to Texas A&M. By the way, spoke to an old friend who works in the agricultural engineering department." Carlos leaned forward, eager to hear more. "What did they say?" "They're very interested in Miguel's irrigation designs. Said they haven't seen that kind of innovative thinking from someone his age in years. They want him to apply for their special scholars program." Carlos's face lit up, but then reality quickly tempered his enthusiasm. "That's wonderful news, but those programs are still expensive, even with scholarships." George nodded, understanding. "One step at a time. First, let's get that application in." Miguel returned with a tray holding 3 glasses of iced tea and a plate of homemade cookies. "My mom's recipe," he explained as he set the tray down. "She always said good cookies make any conversation better." George accepted a glass and a cookie with thanks. The tea was perfectly brewed, with just the right balance of sweetness and mint. The cookie, a simple shortbread with a hint of cinnamon, was remarkably good. "These are excellent," George commented. "Your mother was a talented baker?" Miguel smiled sadly. "She taught me everything she could before she got sick. Said someone needed to keep Papa well fed." An easy conversation flowed between the 3 men, touching on farming techniques, music, and stories of rural Texas life. George found himself genuinely enjoying their company. There was an authenticity to Carlos and Miguel that was refreshing. After years of dealing with the often artificial world of the music industry, it was nearly sunset when George finally stood to leave. "I should get going. Got an early flight tomorrow for a show in Nashville." Carlos and Miguel walked him to his truck. As George opened the driver's door, he turned to them with a thoughtful expression. I've been thinking about my restaurants and that supply arrangement we discussed. Carlos nodded eagerly. We'll be ready for our first harvest in about 2 months. The tomatoes, peppers, and herbs will come in first, followed by the sweet corn and squash. I'd like to propose something a bit different, George said. Rather than waiting for the harvest, I'd like to pre-purchase your entire first crop. Carlos blinked in surprise. The entire crop? But that's a significant commitment, I know, George finished for him. But it makes good business sense. My restaurants in San Antonio, Austin, and Houston all need consistent, high-quality produce. What I'm proposing is a guaranteed purchase contract. You know exactly what you're getting paid, and I know exactly what I'm getting. Miguel looked at his father with wide eyes, clearly understanding the implications of such an arrangement. A guaranteed buyer for their entire harvest would eliminate the uncertainty that kept most small farmers awake at night. That's very generous, Carlos said carefully, but I wouldn't want charity. George shook his head firmly. This isn't charity, it's smart business. I've seen your operation, tasted the produce from your garden. Quality matters in the restaurant. Business and farm-fresh organic vegetables grown with care are exactly what my chefs have been asking for. He reached into his truck and pulled out a folder, handing it to Carlos. My business manager drew up a proposal based on market rates, plus a premium for organic certification. Take some time to look it over. If you have questions or want to negotiate any terms, his contact information is inside. Carlos accepted the folder with slightly trembling hands. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, George replied, with a smile. And that you'll let Miguel apply to that program at Texas A&M? Miguel couldn't contain himself any longer. I will. Apply, that is. George chuckled, then reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like tickets. One more thing, I'm playing at the rodeo in San Antonio next month. Thought you two might like to come as my guests, backstage passes included. Miguel's expression was one of pure shock. Backstage passes? To your concert? Are you serious? Absolutely, George replied, handing the tickets to the teenager. Might be good for you to meet some of those professors from A&M too. I invited a few as my guests. Carlos placed his hand on Miguel's shoulder, his own expression reflecting disbelief at their changing fortunes. Mr. Strait, George, I don't know how we can ever thank you for your kindness. George waved away the gratitude. Just grow good vegetables and make sure this young man gets to A&M. That's thanks enough. He climbed into his truck and started the engine, but rolled down the window before driving away. Oh, and Carlos, bring those cookies to the concert. My band would appreciate them. With that, he drove off, leaving father and son standing in a cloud of dust, staring at the tickets and folder in their hands as if they might disappear at any moment. As the days passed and word spread through Cedar Creek about George Strait's visit to the Mendez farm, the atmosphere in town subtly shifted. People who had previously ignored Carlos and Miguel now found reasons to stop and chat when they saw them in town. Invitations to community events that had never come their way suddenly materialized. The change wasn't lost on either of them. Funny how everyone wants to be our friend now, Miguel commented one afternoon as they left the feed store where the owner had been unusually attentive. Carlos sighed. Human nature, mijo. But remember, George Strait didn't help us because we're suddenly important. He helped us because he saw our hard work and believed in what we're doing. That lesson was driven home the following week when they encountered Blake Thompson at the local diner. The former salesman was now working as a delivery driver for Henderson's farm equipment, part of the educational reassignment Frank Henderson had mentioned. When Blake saw Carlos and Miguel enter the diner, his face flushed with embarrassment, and he quickly looked down at his plate. Miguel noticed his father watching Blake. Want to sit somewhere else, Papa? Carlos shook his head. No, son. We have nothing to be ashamed of. They took seats at the counter not far from where Blake sat alone. The waitress brought their usual coffee for Carlos and chocolate milk for Miguel, with a friendliness that had been absent before their encounter with George Strait. As they placed their lunch orders, Carlos noticed Blake preparing to leave, having barely touched his food. On impulse, Carlos called out, "Mr. Thompson!" Blake froze, then slowly turned to face them, his expression guarded. "Mr. Mendez." "Would you care to join us?" Carlos asked, gesturing to the empty stool beside them. Blake's surprise was evident, as was his suspicion. "Why would you want that?" Carlos shrugged. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Besides, I hear you've been learning the delivery side of the business. Might be good for us to know who'll be bringing our parts and supplies in the future." For a moment, Blake looked like he might refuse. Then, with a hesitant nod, he gathered his plate and coffee and moved to the seat beside them. "Thank you," he said quietly. The conversation was awkward at first, with Miguel remaining protective and reserved. But gradually, as Carlos asked questions about Henderson's delivery routes and service options, the tension began to ease. By the time their food arrived, Blake had begun to speak more naturally, even asking questions about their farming operation. "I heard George Strait visited your place," Blake said finally, the elephant in the room addressed at last. Carlos nodded. "He did. He's interested in our organic vegetables for his restaurants." Blake shook his head in wonderment. Never would have guessed that day would turn out like it did. He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about how I acted, not just with you, but with other customers too. Mr. Henderson was right to reassign me." "How's the delivery job?" Miguel asked, speaking directly to Blake for the first time. Blake managed a small smile. "Humbling. I'm seeing parts of farming operations I never knew existed, learning how hard people work, what they need the equipment for." He looked at Carlos. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Carlos studied the man's face, seeing genuine regret there. "Mistakes make us human, Mr. Thompson. Learning from them makes us better." And as they finished their lunch, Blake reached for his wallet, but Carlos waved him off. "This one's on us." Blake looked confused. "Why would you do that after how I treated you?" Carlos smiled. "Because George Strait showed us kindness when we needed it most. Seems right to pass it along." Blake left the diner with a thoughtful expression, and Miguel watched him go with mixed feelings. "Do you really think he's changed, Papa?" Carlos sipped his coffee before answering. "Time will tell, but change has to start somewhere." The weeks leading up to George Strait's concert were filled with intense work on the farm. The spring planting was completed ahead of schedule thanks to the tractor, and Miguel's irrigation system was performing even better than expected. Carlos found himself watching his son with growing pride, seeing not just a boy, but a young man with extraordinary potential. Miguel had submitted his application to Texas A&M's agricultural engineering program, including detailed plans of his irrigation system and water conservation methods. The response had come quickly, an invitation to visit the campus and meet with the department head during the weekend of George's concert in San Antonio. As they loaded the truck for their journey to San Antonio, Carlos noticed Miguel staring at their fields with an expression of wonder. "What are you thinking about me, Joe?" he asked. Miguel turned to his father, his eyes bright with emotion. "I was remembering what Mom used to say, that blessings come when you least expect them, but exactly when you need them most." Carlos felt his throat tighten with emotion. She was right about that. She'd be so proud of you, Miguel. "Of us," Miguel corrected him. "She'd be proud of us." As they drove toward San Antonio, neither could have predicted how the next 24 hours would change their lives yet again, or that George Strait had one more surprise waiting for them that would leave an entire arena in tears. San Antonio glowed with evening lights as Carlos and Miguel drove into the city. Though they'd been to San Antonio before, it had always been for practical matters, doctor appointments, agricultural supplies, or the occasional school field trip. Never had they come for something as extravagant as a George Strait concert, and certainly never with backstage passes hanging around their necks. "Do you think we're dressed okay?" Miguel asked nervously, glancing down at his best jeans and button-down shirt. He'd polished his only pair of cowboy boots until they gleamed, and even borrowed a bolo tie from Mr. Johnson, his father's former employer. Carlos, similarly attired in his Sunday best, adjusted his hat in the rearview mirror. "We look fine, mijo. George didn't invite us for our fashion sense." They followed the signs to the AT&T Center, joining the stream of vehicles heading for the massive arena. Everywhere they looked, people were dressed in Western wear, many sporting T-shirts with George Strait's image or tour dates. The excitement was palpable, with tailgate parties spread across the parking areas and country music blaring from dozens of trucks. "There are so many people," Miguel marveled, as they finally found a parking spot. "Do you think George will really remember us with all of this going on?" And Carlos placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "I think George Strait is a man of his word, but even if he's too busy, we'll still enjoy the concert. This is a night to remember either way." They made their way to the designated entrance for special guests, both feeling out of place among the confident venue staff and music industry professionals who streamed through the doors. When Carlos hesitantly presented their passes to the security guard, he half expected to be turned away, but the man simply nodded and directed them down a corridor. "First time backstage?" asked a friendly woman with a headset who intercepted them at the end of the hallway. Carlos nodded, trying not to appear as overwhelmed as he felt. "Yes, ma'am. George Strait invited us personally." If the woman was surprised, she didn't show it. "You must be the Mendez family. Mr. Strait mentioned you'd be coming. Follow me, please." She led them through a maze of hallways buzzing with technicians, musicians tuning instruments, and staff carrying equipment. Finally, they entered a large room where several people were gathered around a buffet table. And there, in the center of it all, was George Strait, talking animatedly with members of his band. George spotted them immediately, his face breaking into a warm smile as he excused himself from the conversation. "Carlos, Miguel, glad you made it," he called out, striding toward them with an extended hand. "Thank you for inviting us," Carlos replied, shaking George's hand firmly. "This is quite something." George chuckled. "Bit different from the farm, isn't it? How was your drive-in?" "No problems at all," Carlos assured him. "Miguel brought the cookies you mentioned, his mother's recipe." Miguel, still awestruck, held out the carefully packed container. "I made them fresh yesterday." George accepted the container with genuine enthusiasm. "These might not make it to the band if they're as good as I remember." He turned slightly, gesturing toward a distinguished-looking man in a blazer who had been watching their interaction. "Carlos, Miguel, I'd like you to meet Dr. James Harmon, the head of agricultural engineering at Texas A&M. Miguel's nervousness instantly doubled as the professor approached with an extended hand. "Mr. Mendez, it's a pleasure to meet you. And Miguel, I've been looking forward to meeting the young man behind those irrigation designs. Very impressive work." Miguel stammered his thanks, hardly believing that a university professor had actually reviewed his amateur designs and found them worthy of comment. "Dr. Harmon and I go way back," George explained. "He helped advise me on some water conservation projects for my ranch years ago." The conversation flowed easily, with Dr. Harmon asking Miguel insightful questions about his designs, while Carlos shared details about their expanded farming operation. What had started as an awkward meeting quickly transformed into an engaging discussion about agricultural innovation. "You know," Dr. Harmon said thoughtfully, What you're describing with your variable pressure irrigation system could have applications far beyond your own farm. Have you considered how it might scale? Miguel blinked in surprise. Scale? I've only thought about making it work for our 25 acres. Dr. Harmon nodded. That's typically how innovation begins, solving a specific problem. But your approach to water conservation could benefit farms across Texas, especially in drought-prone regions. Before Miguel could respond, they were interrupted by a production assistant informing George that he was needed for sound check. Duty calls? George said with a smile. Why don't you all come watch from the side of the stage? Best seats in the house. What followed was a dreamlike experience for Carlos and Miguel. They watched from the wings as George Strait and his ace in the whole band performed their sound check, casually running through portions of songs that had topped country music charts for decades. Occasionally, George would glance their way with a smile or a wink, making them feel like they belonged in this extraordinary world so far removed from their daily lives. Dr. Harmon used this time to continue his conversation with Miguel, probing deeper into the young man's understanding of agricultural engineering principles. Carlos observed with quiet pride as his son held his own in the discussion, demonstrating knowledge far beyond his years. Your son has a remarkable mind, Dr. Harmon commented to Carlos as Miguel examined a diagram the professor had sketched. On a napkin, most students come to us with enthusiasm but limited practical experience. Miguel brings both, plus an innovative perspective we don't often see. Carlos nodded. He gets that from his mother. She always saw possibilities where others saw problems. The sound check complete, George rejoined them as venue staff began preparing for the doors to open. What do you think? Ready for the real thing tonight? He asked Miguel. It's amazing, Miguel replied honestly. I never imagined being here like this, George smiled. Well, there's more to come. But first, I wanted to discuss something with your father while you and Dr. Harmon continue your conversation. He gestured for Carlos to join him at a quiet corner of the backstage area, leaving Miguel engrossed in discussion with the professor. Your son is impressive, George said once they were seated. Dr. Harmon isn't easily impressed, and he can't stop talking about Miguel's potential. Carlos beamed with pride. Thank you, we're hoping he gets accepted into the program. George waved a hand dismissively. That's already settled. Dr. Harmon wants him. The question now is financial aid. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. This is what I wanted to discuss with you. Carlos accepted the envelope with a questioning look. It's a proposal, George explained. Not charity, I know you wouldn't accept that. It's a business arrangement. Inside the envelope, Carlos found a detailed contract outlining a partnership between Strait Enterprises and Mendez Farms. According to the terms, George would provide capital for expanding their operation to 50 acres, with options for further growth based on performance. In return, Mendez Farms would supply premium organic produce, not only to George's restaurants, but also to a network of high-end establishments throughout Texas. This is substantial, Carlos said carefully, trying to process the magnitude of what George was proposing. It's an investment, George corrected him. The demand for locally grown organic produce exceeds supply, especially for restaurants trying to distinguish themselves in competitive markets. What you and Miguel are doing, sustainable farming with innovative water conservation, that's the future. I'm just getting in on the ground floor. Carlos studied the contract details, noting that it included provisions for Miguel's education, categorized as agricultural research and development, essential to the partnership's growth. Why us? Carlos asked finally. You could partner with established operations. George considered the question before answering. Throughout my career, I've learned to recognize authenticity. What you and Miguel are building isn't just a business. It's a legacy, born from hard work and genuine passion. That's something my brand can stand behind proudly." He paused, then added more softly, "And maybe I see something of myself in you, both. I didn't get where I am without people believing in me when it mattered most." Carlos felt emotion welling up in his throat. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," George replied. "Discuss it with Miguel. This affects his future too." Their conversation was interrupted by the venue manager announcing that doors were opening. George excused himself to prepare for the show, promising to reconnect after the performance. As Carlos rejoined his son and Dr. Harmon, Miguel's excited chatter about potential research projects made it clear that the professor had already taken him under his wing. Carlos couldn't help wondering how their simple life had transformed so dramatically in just a few weeks, all because George Strait had happened to visit Henderson's farm equipment on the same day they went to buy a tractor. The arena filled rapidly, the energy building as 20,000 fans took their seats. Carlos and Miguel watched from their privileged position at the side of the stage, still hardly believing they were there. When the lights finally dimmed and the crowd erupted into cheers, Miguel grabbed his father's arm in excitement. For the next 2 hours, they witnessed George Strait at his finest, performing hit after hit with the ease and charm that had made him a legend. The crowd sang along to every song, creating a powerful chorus that filled the massive space. Carlos couldn't help reflecting on how music, like farming, had the power to bring people together across all backgrounds and circumstances. Halfway through the show, something unexpected happened. George finished Amarillo by Morning to thunderous applause, then stepped to the microphone with a thoughtful expression. "You know, folks," he said as the band softened their playing. Behind him, "I've been blessed to do what I love for many years now, but sometimes life reminds you what's really important." He paused, looking toward the side of the stage. "A few weeks ago, I met a father and son who reminded me of what real determination looks like." Carlos felt his heart rate quicken as George continued. This father saved for 7 years to buy a tractor so his son could go to college. 7 years of extra jobs, sacrifice, and unwavering focus on the future. Not his future, his son's future. The arena had grown quiet, 20,000 people hanging on George's words. "That kind of love and dedication isn't something you see every day," George continued, "and it got me thinking about my own father and all he sacrificed for me." He signaled to the band, who began the gentle introduction to a song Carlos didn't recognize. "I'd like to play something new for you tonight," George said. "It's called A Father's Dream, and I'd like to dedicate it to Carlos and Miguel Mendez, who are with us here tonight. This one's for every parent who's ever given up something so their child could have more." As George began to sing, the lyrics told a story that paralleled Carlos's journey with Miguel, the late nights, the sacrifices, the unwavering belief in a better tomorrow. Tears welled in Carlos's eyes as he realized George had written a song inspired by their story. Miguel gripped his father's hand tightly, his own eyes glistening in the reflected stage lights. Around them, crew members and musicians who had witnessed their backstage interaction with George nodded in recognition of the song's origins. When George sang the chorus, "In a father's dream, there's a child reaching higher than he ever could, standing on the shoulders of sacrifice and love," Carlos could no longer contain his emotion. Tears flowed freely down his cheeks as the weight of the past 7 years, the grief, the struggle, the doubts, seemed to lift from his shoulders, acknowledged and honored in this most unexpected way. As the song concluded, the arena erupted into applause more thunderous than any that had come before. George turned toward Carlos and Miguel, offering a subtle nod that spoke volumes. In that moment, Carlos understood that their story had become part of something larger than themselves, a testament to perseverance that would resonate with everyone who heard this song. What Carlos couldn't know, as he stood there overcome with emotion, was that A Father's Dream would become one of George Strait's most beloved hits in the years to come. Nor could he have predicted how his life would change after that night, how the video of George's performance and dedication would go viral, bringing unexpected attention to their small farm and Miguel's innovations. The remainder of the concert passed in an emotional blur. When George finally closed with his signature, "The Cowboy Rides Away," the crowd rose to their feet in appreciation. Backstage after the show, surrounded by industry executives and venue staff, George made a point of introducing Carlos and Miguel to everyone he spoke with, describing Miguel as the future of Texas agriculture, with such conviction that no one questioned it. As the night wound down, Dr. Harmon approached Carlos with papers in hand. "I've drafted a preliminary acceptance to our scholars program for Miguel," he explained. "Normally there's a formal process, but after seeing his designs and speaking with him tonight, I'm convinced he belongs at A&M. We can sort the details tomorrow when you visit campus." Carlos thanked him, still processing everything that had happened. As midnight approached, George found them preparing to leave, concerned about the long drive back to their motel on the outskirts of the city. "Nonsense," George said firmly. "I've arranged rooms for you at the hotel where we're staying. You'll need your rest before visiting campus tomorrow." When Carlos began to object, George held up a hand to stop him. "Call it a business expense if it makes you feel better. Partners take care of each other." As they followed George's assistant to a waiting car, Miguel whispered to his father, "Do you think Mum somehow arranged all this? It feels like she's watching over us." Carlos looked up at the night sky, stars barely visible through the city lights, and smiled. "If anyone could orchestrate a miracle like this from heaven, it would be your mother." Oh, what neither Carlos nor Miguel realized as they drove away was that George Strait remained watching them from the venue entrance, a thoughtful expression on his face. The country music legend had one more surprise planned for them, one that would test Carlos's pride and potentially change everything. A quiet calm settled over Carlos and Miguel as they were escorted to the hotel suite George had arranged. After the roar of the crowd and the emotional intensity of the concert, the luxurious silence felt almost jarring. They walked through the elegant lobby, past guests who seemed oblivious to the whirlwind the past few hours had been. The suite itself was larger than their entire farmhouse, with plush furniture, a separate living area, and a breathtaking view of the city lights. Miguel wandered from room to room, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Papa, is this real? Are we really here?" Carlos, though equally astonished, felt a familiar ache in his leg and sank onto a comfortable armchair. "It's real, mijo. Sometimes life takes turns you never expect." They talked late into the night, rehashing every moment of the concert, the meeting with Dr. Harmon, and George's incredible gesture of dedicating a song to them. Carlos held the partnership contract in his hands, the weight of the paper feeling immense. "What do you think about this, Papa?" Miguel asked, gesturing to the contract. "It's a lot," Carlos sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "It's an opportunity, Miguel, one we couldn't have dreamed of a month ago. But accepting help on this scale, it's difficult." "Because of pride?" Miguel asked gently. Carlos looked at his son, seeing the understanding in his eyes. "Yes, because of pride. Your mother and I, we always made our own way. Struggled, yes, but we never relied on anyone else. This feels different." "But it's a partnership, Papa," Miguel reasoned. "George isn't giving us charity. He sees something in our farm, in our work. He believes we can make this successful together." "I know," Carlos said, his voice heavy. "And for your future, mijo, For you to go to A&M and use your talents, this could make it possible without a lifetime of debt. They finally drifted, off to sleep, the city lights twinkling outside the window, their minds buzzing with the possibilities and challenges that lay ahead. The next morning, after a breakfast spread unlike anything they'd ever seen, they were met in the lobby by a university representative who drove them to the Texas A&M campus in San Antonio. The campus was impressive, a sprawling complex of modern buildings dedicated to agricultural research and education. Dr. Harmon greeted them warmly, his enthusiasm for Miguel's potential evident. He spent the next few hours giving them a personalized tour, introducing Miguel to professors and researchers, showing him state-of-the-art labs and experimental fields. Miguel was in his element, asking insightful questions and eagerly discussing his ideas. "Miguel, we'd be thrilled to have you join our program," Dr. Harmon stated clearly as they sat in his office. "Your application is outstanding, and your practical experience combined with your innovative thinking is exactly what we look for in our Scholars Program candidates." He slid a formal acceptance letter across the desk to Miguel. "This confirms your place for the fall semester." Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the letter, a look of pure joy and relief washing over his face. Carlos watched, his heart swelling with pride. This was the moment they had worked and sacrificed for. "Now, about the financial aspect," Dr. Harmon continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "The Scholars Program includes a significant scholarship covering tuition and fees. However, there are still costs for housing, books, and living expenses. We have various grants and work-study opportunities, but there will likely still be a gap." Carlos nodded, already anticipating this. "We understand, Doctor. We will do everything we can to cover the remaining costs." "I'm confident we can find ways to make it work," Dr. Harmon assured them. "Miguel's potential is too great to let financial constraints stand in the way." As they were leaving Dr. Harmon's office, the university representative mentioned that George Strait had requested they stop by his suite before heading home. Carlos felt a knot of anticipation tighten in his stomach. He hadn't formally accepted the partnership proposal yet, and he knew that conversation was coming. Back at the hotel, they were led to George's suite, which was even larger and more lavish than their own. George was there along with his business manager, a sharp-looking woman named Elaine. "Carlos, Miguel, come on in," George said, rising to greet them. "How was the campus visit?" "It was incredible, George," Miguel said, still clutching his acceptance letter. "Dr. Harmon accepted me into the Scholars Program." "That's fantastic news, son," George exclaimed, genuinely pleased. "I knew you could do it." He turned to Carlos. "He's going to do great things, Carlos. You've raised a remarkable young man." "Thank you, George," Carlos replied, feeling a lump in his throat. They sat down, and the conversation naturally turned to the future. Elaine presented the partnership contract again, explaining the terms in detail. "As you can see, Mr. Mendez," Elaine said professionally, "this is a mutually beneficial agreement. Strait Enterprises provides the capital for expansion and guarantees a market for your produce, while Mendy's Farms provides high-quality, organically grown vegetables that meet the increasing demand from our restaurants and network of buyers." Carlos listened intently, understanding the business logic. The offer was more than fair. It was generous, providing a level of security and growth potential they could never achieve on their own. Yet, the thought of accepting such a massive investment, of being tied to someone as famous and wealthy as George Strait, still felt overwhelming. "I appreciate the offer, George." "Elaine," Carlos said slowly, "it's a tremendous opportunity, but the amount of capital involved, it's a lot to take on." George leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "Carlos, I understand your hesitation. You're a proud man, and you've built what you have through sheer hard work. You don't want anything handed to you." Carlos nodded, relieved that George understood. "But this isn't about handing anything out," George continued. "It's about investing in potential. I believe in your farm, and I believe in Miguel's future. That song I sang last night, A Father's Dream, I meant every word of it. It was inspired by your story, yes, but it also made me think about my own father and the dreams he had for me." He paused, looking directly at Carlos. "My father, John Strait, wasn't a wealthy man. He worked hard his whole life. He taught me the value of honesty, integrity, and perseverance. He always told me that if you find something worth believing in, you invest in it not just with money, but with your heart." George took a deep breath. "Carlos, I want to do more than just partner with your farm. I want to ensure Miguel has every opportunity to pursue his dream at A&M without the burden of financial worry weighing him down, or you down." Carlos braced himself, expecting George to offer to pay for everything outright, the very thing his pride resisted. "I've been working with Elaine and my financial advisors," George said, "to set up something that honors the spirit of that song, A Father's Dream. It's not a foundation, not a public charity. It's a private named scholarship fund at Texas A&M, specifically for students from rural Texas who demonstrate innovative thinking in agriculture and face financial challenges." Carlos listened, intrigued. "I'm calling it the John Strait Memorial Scholarship for Agricultural Innovation," George announced. "And I want Miguel to be the very first recipient." He looked at Carlos, his eyes conveying the depth of his sincerity. "This scholarship isn't a handout, Carlos. It's an investment in the kind of talent and dedication that our country needs. It's funded by me, personally in my father's name, to help young people like Miguel achieve their potential, just like my father helped me achieve mine." This was the surprise, the test of pride. Accepting this scholarship wasn't just accepting money. It was accepting a deeply personal gift tied to George's own family legacy and the song that had moved thousands. It required Carlos to accept that his family's struggle and Miguel's talent had touched a chord with George Strait on a profound level. Carlos was speechless. The scholarship wasn't charity in the traditional sense. It was a tribute, a perpetuation of a legacy, and an investment in the future. It honored his son's hard work and ingenuity while simultaneously honoring George's own father. It bypassed the public institutional feel of a foundation, making it intensely personal. "George," Carlos began, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know what to say." "Say yes, Carlos," George urged gently. "Let my father's legacy help your son build his future. Let a father's dream become a reality for Miguel and for other students like him down the road." Miguel, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. "Papa, it's amazing. It's not just money, it's hope." Carlos looked at his son's hopeful face, then at George, seeing not a celebrity, but a man who understood the weight of a father's dreams. The pride that had been a shield for so long began to soften, replaced by overwhelming gratitude and a sense of connection. "Okay, George," Carlos said, tears finally escaping and rolling down his cheeks. "Okay, we accept. Thank you for everything." George rose and extended his hand, not just for a handshake, but pulling Carlos into a warm embrace. "You're welcome, Carlos. It's an honor to be a small part of your story." The partnership contract for the farm was signed that day, solidifying the business relationship that would provide the resources for Mendez Farms to flourish. The John Strait Memorial Scholarship was established, ensuring Miguel's path to Texas A&M was clear. In the years that followed, Mendez Farms grew into a renowned supplier of organic produce, known for its quality and sustainable practices. Thanks in large part to Miguel's innovative methods developed during his studies at A&M, funded by the scholarship. Miguel excelled at university, graduating at the top of his class and returning to the farm to implement his knowledge, expanding their operation further and even helping other small farmers in the region adopt similar water-saving techniques. A Father's Dream became a massive hit for George Strait, resonating deeply with audiences worldwide. In interviews, George often spoke about the inspiration behind the song, sharing the story of Carlos and Miguel, bringing unexpected recognition and admiration to the Mendez family and their farm. Carlos, his leg healed as much as it ever would. He continued to work the land alongside his son, his heart full. He had learned that true strength wasn't just in doing everything alone, but in accepting help when it was offered with genuine kindness and shared purpose. His pride remained, but it was a different kind of pride, a pride in his son's accomplishments, in their farm's success, and in the unexpected bonds forged through hardship and hope. Blake Thompson, having learned humility through his delivery, Job and Carlos's unexpected kindness eventually returned to Henderson's in a new role focused on customer outreach and support for small farmers. He became a valuable contact for Mendez Farms, proving that second chances were possible. The story of George Strait, the humble farmer and the determined son, became a local legend, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive not on a stage, but in the quiet aisles of a farm equipment store, disguised as unexpected kindness and the shared understanding of a father's dream.